So I'm looking forward to taking your calls live here in a moment. And the second hour, get a chance to interview my good friend and colleague Scott Ray, one of the leading ethicists in the world today, talking about some of the thorniest ethical issues that you and I face as Christians. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, I teach at Biola University in the Apologetics program full-time, really Talbot School of Theology. And I also teach high school part-time. I love working with high school students. My passion is really for the next generation. I also have 3 of my own kids at this school. And my students just graduated a few weeks ago. And I asked a student who had been in my class for 4 years, I said, what's one of the most memorable principles or insights or maybe illustrations that I shared with you? And he goes, oh, clearly it's the beach ball illustration. Now, before we jump in, this is not a tactic you're obviously familiar with. Hopefully all of you have read. If you haven't read Tactics yet, you got to get up a copy right now and read it. It's a go-to book in apologetics. But this illustration I'm going to give you is not really a tactic, so to speak. Like, say, using the different tactics that Greg talks about, like taking the roof off. Rather, what this is a helpful illustration as Christians that if we think about it this way, we can approach culture, see certain truths in the world, and make better sense of them. So it's just simply called the beach ball example, and maybe I need a better name for that, but it's a beach ball example. Now think about a beach ball for a moment. You've seen multicolored beach balls playing out in the water. It's something you hit around, you play catch with, maybe just fun to try to keep in the air. We've all played it with our kids or with other people. Well, what happens if you take a beach ball and you try to push it under the water? Well, at some point, all of us in the pool or the ocean have tried to do this, and we push it down, but what happens? By its very nature, it pops itself back up. It won't stay submerged under the water. It wants to pop itself back up. And that's because of the air in the beach ball, because of the laws of gravity, because of the nature of water itself. It simply won't stay down. In fact, to keep it down, it takes a lot of effort to push the beach ball down and, in fact, kind of fight against the forces of nature to keep this thing under water. Now, where am I going with this? Part of the illustration I think is so powerful is that everybody approaches reality with a certain worldview. We all have a perspective of reality, whether atheist, postmodernist, Christian, Muslim, Jew, Mormon, you name it. We all have a perspective of reality. But there's only one reality, or as Greg would say, a story of reality that we all actually live within. So if somebody's worldview does not match up with reality, at some point their worldview is going to suppress something that is true that doesn't match up with the real world, which would kind of be like pushing a beach ball under the water, and it's going to pop itself back up. So as I look at different worldviews, different belief systems, different ideas that people hold, insofar as they don't match up with the real story of reality, at some point, either big or small, they will be pushing the beach ball underwater, and it's going to pop itself back up. So I look for these moments, whether in conversations with people, whether in their writings, listening to somebody speak. I'm thinking, okay, where in this person's worldview do they believe something, probably sincerely, which doesn't match up with the Christian worldview, which is reality? And so at some point they're making a claim, but the beach ball pops itself back up and simply won't stay down because their worldview does not match up with reality. So let's take the issue of morality. Now, take the atheist perspective, for example. There are some atheists who basically atheists have one of 2 options. One, they can say morality is objective, and then try to ground morality somewhere within a naturalistic universe. Or they can say, yeah, there's no God, there's no objective moral values and duties, and kind of just own it. Well, what happens is, let's take the first one, for example, where people will say, for example, actually it was the second one, where people will say, if there is no God, all is permissible, meaning that In a naturalistic universe, there's no real objective right and wrong. Now, as we think about this issue, think about this worldview somebody holds. They're pushing the beach ball of morality underneath the water because that's what their worldview requires. But the problem is, people cannot live their lives and won't live their lives as if morality is subjective. If you hang out with an atheist or a skeptic or anybody who says morality is subjective, it's only a matter of time before this person will make the claim or some kind of objective moral claim about reality, which would be the beach ball popping to the surface. And of course, C.S. Lewis famously said in his book, Mere Christianity, the beginning of that book is just the most clear case for objective morality that I'm familiar with. I hope everybody would read that. And he famously said, if you tell somebody essentially that there's no right and wrong, watch that person a moment later, they're going to cry foul. They're going to say, wait a minute, and argue that something was right or something was wrong, which is contradicting themselves, and the beach ball coming to the surface. So to give a specific example of this, probably 8 or 10 years ago, I was teaching high school down at Capistrano Valley Christian Schools full-time, and I was teaching Bible classes, apologetics classes, worldview, working with students. And we heard one of my students came into me and he said, do you realize at the public school across town, this free-thinking atheist group has popped up? They have a kind of a faculty advisor, and they held an event and a lecture, and 100 students showed up to hear about this kind of skeptical atheist approach to life. Then they asked me, they're like, what do you want to do about it? Well, since I didn't have a great response at that point, I've learned I'm just going to ask them a question back and see if they can come up with something. So I said to them, I said, gosh, thanks for telling me. What do you guys want to do about it? We brainstorm, we talk, and he and a couple other friendly students who came over with him said, you know what? I've got an idea. Let's see if 3 students from their atheist club would be willing to have a public debate with 3 students from our Christian club here at CVCS. I said, that's a wonderful idea, and they agreed. Well, we filled out our church at that time, which was probably 350, maybe 400 people, standing room only, and it was a high school student debate. I moderated it on this Darwinian worldview versus kind of intelligent design, on the historical Jesus, whether he's God or just a historical myth or figure, and then the question of morality. And they each had different times. It was kind of a formal debate. It was really fun. People were engaged into it. And I remember at one point, my student got up there and said, we all know there's a right and a wrong. We live this way. We act this way. We expect people to follow it. And she said, that's because there's a moral law, and that points towards a moral law giver. So morality points towards God, and she sits down. And then the other student got up there, described himself as an agnostic, and he said, there is no objective moral law. In fact, it's kind of like ice cream. It's all preference. You have your opinions, live according to them. We have our opinions and live according to them. And then he sat down. Then shortly after this, it was time for the closing, time for the closing speech. And they were supposed to sum up in a debate why your side won. But instead, this student who had just said morality is subjective stands up in front of the church, realizing his audience is primarily Christians. And keep in mind, he had just said morality is subjective, like ice cream. He looks at the audience and he says, you guys are a bunch of bigots. You're homophobic. You're intolerant. You are hateful. Shame on you. And he sits down. And I'm sitting there as the host thinking, oh my goodness, am my students going to pick up on this? Now, if you're a regular Stand to Reason listener, you already know what's going on. 5 minutes earlier, he said morality is subjective. There's no standard. But because his worldview is pushing the beach ball under the water, it pops back up to the surface. And he can't but help make objective moral condemnations of Christians who he thinks is objectively wrong. Friends, in the area of morality, some people might not believe there's right and wrong, or they might say there's not a right and wrong, or their worldview might require it, but they live in God's world and can't live it out. They're going to push the beach ball down, and it's going to pop back up. Even people who say they don't believe in God and embrace different worldviews live in the world that God has made. As you analyze different worldviews, Remember the beach ball, because that is a practical way to see that people live in God's world and may try to suppress it to greater and lesser degrees, but the truth is going to pop to the surface.